Now, the Common Lectionary, which is a form of readings for each Sunday that I sometimes use, the Common Lectionary does not include the first verse that I included this morning. And that's why originally I only included starting from verse 19 instead of verse 18. I believe that the committee who laid out the passages for the Common Lectionary got a little bit anxious about the idea of slavery and the fact that Peter told people to obey their masters. They were afraid of appearing to support slavery or other forms of subservience. And so they took the easy way out, and they focused on how we are to treat all people who treat us, who act unfairly to us. In the end, all we get is something that we already know, that life is unfair at some times. And that somehow misses the point that Peter wanted to make in this passage of his letter. Certainly, we find slavery reprehensible. And that's why we abandoned the practice 150 years ago. But, and many of you know this, Marge, but it still exists, hidden in many places in this world and even in the United States. Did you know that? It can even be found in cities not too far from us, where criminals oppress individuals for their personal gain. It's hidden because it's illegal. It's hidden because society doesn't like it, but it is there all the same. In Jesus' day and in Peter's day, slavery was a common practice. Slaves were kept by people who were better off than the lowest in society, the servant class or the beggar class, if you will. These slaves did domestic work, but most often were found in agricultural work where a wealthy landowner might hold hundreds of slaves to work on his plantation or his farm. The wealthy landowner needed lots of labor, plenty of laborers, and it was cheaper to own a slave than to pay for hired workers. Another place that slaves were used was in industry, making pottery or bricks, possibly manufacturing weapons, and certainly in mining. Occasionally, we might find an educated slave who served as a tutor or a teacher for children of a wealthy family. Can you imagine the first century slave who also became a Christian? You see, the slave owners often trusted their slaves and let them go to the market to shop for the family, unaccompanied. And they often gave them time off to visit their own family and their friends and to worship in whatever way they might worship. This gave opportunity for servants or slaves to learn about this new faith that had come up, sprung up from Palestine, from Judea, from Jerusalem, to find out about this Christianity. And it was attractive to them because the stories that were told about Jesus showed how much care, how much compassion he had for the people who were in the lowest classes, the lepers, and the lame, and the deaf, and the blind, who were all beggars because they had no way to earn a living. Jesus uplifted the lowest people on the social pyramid, the people at the bottom of the heap. That's why so many of the first Christians came from the slave class or the servant class. It was a bit unusual for a wealthy person to become a Christian in those early days. It made for awkward relationships when an owner became a Christian and attended the same church that their slave attended. Can you imagine if a slave had been made a deacon in the church and then a new Christian, his owner, walked in to the house where they were worshiping and found that their slave, the one whom they lorded over at home, was now over him because he was a deacon. Made for awkward things, didn't it? It was unusual for a richer person to become a Christian. And yet, here was Peter talking about slavery and encouraging slaves to submit completely to the authority of the owner in the context of the home or the farm or the business. You see, Peter was concerned about showing that Christians were not going to be subversive to the society. He wanted the wider society to understand that Christians were going to be good citizens. He wanted to protect the church from discrimination and persecution. So he took special care to demonstrate cooperation with the established order of society. You see, Christians were very much a minority and under suspicion of being against the established government because they called Jesus their king. And they had other magistrates and kings whom the people should have been obeying. They had to speak and act carefully. Now, for Christians of today, slavery is an intolerable evil. Our understanding of slavery has come a long way from the first century Asia Minor and the Roman Empire, indeed the whole Roman Empire. We also know that as Christians and as citizens, we have the authority to demand changes in the structures of our society, especially when those structures are evil. Social forces demand a critique from our Christian point of view. We need to involve ourselves in changing certain things in our culture. Because if we don't, then we're ignoring something very basic that Jesus has taught us. But Peter's caution still has an important warning for us. We cannot demand change without looking at the deeper reasons for the institution. Yes, we know now that slavery denies the basic humanity of a slave. But Peter and the early Christians did not really think that the world would last much longer anyway. They thought the world was going to come to an end with Jesus coming again. Today, we have recognized the deeper evil and identified the basic insult to God in the form of slavery, because God intends all people to find freedom in their relationship to Him. And that freedom in God implies that every human being needs to find governmental and personal freedom. So then, how can I come up with an alternative ethic out of this passage? Let's look for a moment at what Peter advocates. In the midst of society where Christians take a very tiny place, a very small place, he wants his readers to convince others, not by word or speech, but by the power of their actions. You see, Peter wants the Christians in the churches he associates with, the churches that this letter went to. He wants the Christians in those churches not to go out and form a revolution by force or by word, but to form a different kind of revolution. Rather than looking for revenge in the presence of injustice, he calls them to endure, and by that act of endurance to do good things, even in the face of evil, and in their actions, in their doing good, in their kindnesses towards even the people who hurt them, to begin to change the world. Now that's subversive. Some might even say it's passive-aggressive. But it really subverts the actions of the evildoer. Because the evildoer wants you to react to the evil that's done to them. If instead you react in the opposite way, you're going to make them stop and think. People's minds are changed much more quickly by actions than by arguing and fighting. When we act in kindness towards the person that has hurt us, it disarms them. They step back and they wonder what's going on. And then they begin to wonder why they should punish us. When Gandhi saw that the British charged too much for the cotton fabric that was woven in England and then brought back to India because cotton was grown in India, Gandhi encouraged the Indian people to spin their own cotton thread and then to weave their own cotton cloth. The British administration decided to punish the Indian people for this kind of resistance. And so they withheld salt from the markets. I don't know if you remember this. Now, in a hot climate, salt is necessary for life, in addition to the other things that salt does, like preserve foods. So Gandhi encouraged the Indian people to go to the ocean and evaporate the salt water from the ocean to make their own salt. And they went by the hundreds of thousands to the Bay of Bengal and began the process of making sea salt by evaporation. Now the British colonial administration got angry, and they sent troops to attack the Indian people. But the English women in London and Liverpool and Durham and Essex and Exeter and all over the countryside began to take notice. They complained about the bad treatment to which the colonial government had subjected the Indian people. And finally, after more struggle, you know that India was granted independence. And the colonial oppression of India ended. Along with it was Burma. You see, Gandhi never fought back. He always spoke kindly and gently. And ultimately, the world changed for the Indian people. Kathleen will probably have to correct me in this next story. There was a young man